inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and share my new book. The origin of this book is, I've lived in the US for 40 years. I went there to do a PhD in physics and switched to computer science when computer science was hardly an established field at the time. Then I worked in the computer industry, then in the software industry, then switched to the telecom industry and got into corporate strategic planning, marketing, those kind of things. And then I became a management consultant to industry, advising on where the future is, what technologies, what markets and things of that sort. And had some large AT&T, British Telecom, these kind of clients and media clients. And that's before the internet existed. We were just trying to convince people that email is a valid way to replace telex. I remember we used to have those fights. And then I became an entrepreneur, started my own companies. And at one time I had my own companies. I started in 20 countries. And then in '94, I decided that instead of going on doing the same thing forever, it's better to leave and reinvent myself, do something different. And I had no background in humanities, which is typical of Indians who are technocrats. We don't have humanities background because we specialize at a very young age. So I am self-taught in the humanities. I was very interested in philosophy. I wanted to understand the real philosophy of the quantum philosophy and Indian philosophy and see if there is a relationship there. And comparative religion, history, culture, these kind of things I started studying. And I looked at the biases and prejudice against Indian civilization as a result of my studies. My foundation would give grants. People are always very happy to take the money because it's good to have money. But then the work would always be with a certain tilt. And I feel anyone who's got a science technology kind of background can think logically, can think analytically. You can learn these things better than people who might have spent their whole career studying these things. And so for the last 20 years I spent all my time, and this is not a hobby, I do it full time, researching on matters of Indian civilization, Indian identity, Indian contributions to the world, past, present and future, and how India is situated in the world thinking, where is it unfair, where is it fair, and what can be done about it. So that's sort of the area. Now, one of the things I noticed is that because the West has a history of being very powerful in recent centuries, most of the discourse has been produced by the West or using Western paradigms. So it became, by default, it became universal. So the West's idea of history, the West's idea of philosophy became sort of the world standard, and everybody's taught in that way. So if you study philosophy in India, you learn Hegel and you learn these kind of Western thinkers. And so the Western experience and their way of looking at the world, their lens, has become universal. And this is now being challenged by China. Chinese claim that Confucian thought has its own Confucian ethics, Confucian modernity, and they contest the West's claim of being the sole approach to the modern world. There's also Islamic contest against Western claims. So I started wondering, is there an Indian challenge to that also? And that's where this book came about. The methodology I used is to observe the West as an Indian, because I lived there for 40 years. So even when I was in business, I was always making observations on how Westerners are different. You sometimes come across behavior that strikes you as unusual for an Indian to come across some behavior. Most Indians have had similar kind of experiences but might not have decided to study it formally, and I decided I'll actually study it formally. So I would look at how they react to a situation, and reach my own conclusions. And this method of reversing the gaze, which means they've been gazing at us, sending scholars, studying us for hundreds of years. The whole study of Indology by Europeans is a good example, and anthropology and all that, studying Indians in the Western frame of reference. Reversing it, so using the Indian frame of reference to study the West. This I felt is necessary, and we don't have enough people who do that. There are people called post-colonial scholars who do this, but they're using Western paradigms to study the West. They're really unfamiliar with, uneducated in Indian thought, and some of them actually hate it. So they are not really Indians studying the West, they just happen to have Indian skin, but they're really Western mindset studying the West. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who would be well versed in classical Indian philosophical systems and trying to look at the West on Indian terms. There is another group of people who understand Indian thought very well, but they are well read in Sanskrit and Indian classics and history and so forth. But such people are not well informed about the West. So they're not able to do the kind of project I'm doing, because to do this project you need to know both sides. If you're trying to do a comparative, you need to understand both sides. Then the other factor that I used is that when I went to the West, I was 20 years old, and started in a very junior capacity, so I couldn't raise my voice and be critical and all of those things. But I was always observant. And then when I became a corporate executive, I had thousands of people reporting to me, so I had to sort out their problems, their differences, their disputes, and I had to understand their mindset, their psychology, and so on. When I became a businessman, I had to negotiate with them, have problems with them, be partners with them. So understanding the Western mindset is very critical for you people, as you grow up and face the world, live in the competitive world. You will find that things you take for granted is not necessarily the way everybody is. I mean, if you are in a deal with some Chinese people, they have different way of thinking. If you are negotiating with some Japanese people, you must understand some cultural nuances. If you're dealing with French, they're different than if you're dealing with Americans. There are definitely civilizational differences. Now, in all these other countries I just named, the education system teaches them about their own sense of grand history and special way of looking at the world, what is different about them, their sense of identity. They're very proud of it. All kinds of Americans who are highly educated they've studied in school about the founding fathers. My kids went to schools to study about the founding fathers and their great past and whatnot. So they're well informed and very secure and very confident. I noticed that when Indians face a kind of civilizational encounter, they're not able to represent themselves. They're very shy, very embarrassed, some have a complex. They want to avoid the issue. So, in fact, my sense of identity inquiry started when I went to America, because the environment forced me to answer these questions. I never thought of these questions, but the environment forces you to answer the question. You can either undertake a study and figure out what to say, or you can just always live in a complex and hide from the problem and hide from the question and run away, which is seen as being a coward or being a weak person, because those civilizations are very assertive and very proud of their identity, and they give you a chance to explain your views, and you should know how to explain your views. So I did it out of necessity. I also did it because when I became owner of many companies, I had to understand that these guys are Polish people, they are different than these guys were Russian people, and these guys are Czech people, they are having a partition with Slovak people. Why are they partitioning Czechoslovakia into Czech and Slovak? Because I had companies there. And why the French are different from the Germans. So I had to understand their differences with each other, because I was doing business there. How Koreans feel about Japanese and how Japanese feel about Chinese. It was very important to understand all that. So I'll give you an example of my disappointment with Indians In 2005, the Crown Princess of Thailand wanted to do a World Sanskrit Conference. Now, if somebody wants to do a conference on French civilization, the French government will be so excited, love it, and help you. And if somebody wanted to do a Mandarin, Chinese, classical studies, Chinese government will help you. But here, the Indian government, ironically at that time BJP government, did not want to help at all, just had no interest. And the Crown Princess is very interested in Sanskrit herself, student of Sanskrit, has a tutor, and her sons have she sent them to India to learn Sanskrit, and she wanted to start a college of Sanskrit, and they inaugurated a journal of Sanskrit in which I wrote the first paper, first article. And so a professor from Delhi University was sort of organizing this for the Thai royal family, and he called me in panic that no help is coming from Indian government. It's looking like a big embarrassment, that they think of India as their mother civilization, like the West thinks of Greece as the mother civilization. Many of these ASEAN countries think of India as the mother civilization, but this mother has no interest. It's like they are orphans, have abandoned them, because I keep delaying, telling them, yeah, we'll get support, but the government is not supporting. And then he called me and said, why don't your foundation, you live in the US, but we'll make it look like Indian funding, and at least we'll save face. So I said, we are a tiny foundation, but I'll do what I can. So we sponsored, my foundation sponsored. And the Thai people and my foundation became the sponsors. So the whole program is set, and the inauguration, the Thai princess is there, I'm there, we're supposed to inaugurate. Just a few days before, there is a sudden desire on the part of HRD minister from India because they realize it's becoming a very successful thing. Somebody else has done all the hard work, but they want to hijack it. So suddenly I'm told that no, the Indian side will be represented by HRD minister, as if I am thrown out after doing all this work. So I protested, said, you can't do that, because we've been there organizing this thing for so long, and why should some politician come to take the limelight? The politician, of course, wants the limelight. So a compromise was reached that all three of us will be present. Thai people will be present, the HRD minister will be present, I'll be three-way coordination. So the conference went very well, and then there was a reception given dinner reception, cocktail reception given by the Indian embassy. Suddenly the Indian embassy realized that this is of value. They had no idea. This is value. So when the reception was going on, I was sitting with people from the embassy, young people, foreign service people. So I asked them, what is the Indian foreign policy on projecting its civilization as an asset? Soft power, the Americans call it soft power, which means you project your culture as something of value to others. And hard power means military and all that. Soft power is this kind of thing. So I said, projecting Indian civilization as soft power, as a foreign policy in ASEAN countries which think India is the mother civilization. In Indonesia, the language is called Bahasa. In Malaysia, it's called Bahasa, and so on. So these foreign service people were totally surprised at the question. I mean, they had no answer. They never thought of it. They said, we don't know. We don't have any policy like that. I said, why? He said, sir, because we are a secular country. So I said, what does secular have to do with civilization? And there is a demand for it, so you should supply it. You should set up Sanskrit colleges and colleges on Indian dance and Indian thought, and because these people want it. It will help you in your trade, it will help you in your technology, it will help you in doing business in these countries. Well, anyway, that's the kind of experience I've had with Indians being in denial mode and embarrassed and so on. So I started doing my own research on what is distinct about the Indian civilization. Another problem I found is our gurus, rather than explaining what is distinct about their worldview, they like to get quick followers. And to get quick followers, they talk about how everything is same. There is no difference, everything is same. And because that way the other party is more comfortable, they can win more followers, get more money quickly. Whereas to explain what is distinct takes more time and more quality audience. But of course, then you'll have a quality audience rather than quantity audience. So gurus are also to blame. I blame them a lot in this for mapping and translating Indian ideas into Western frameworks, which create a distortion. So, one of the chapters in this book is on Sanskrit words that are non-translatable, that have no equivalent, and by translating you are actually diluting the meaning, and you are, just to try and make it easy for people to understand, you're distorting the meaning. What happens if everything about you gets translated to a Western equivalent is that you become redundant. You see? If every idea, every word, every thought, every technique, everything is replaced by a Western equivalent, then you belong in a museum. Your civilization has been digested. So I introduce the term digestion of one civilization into another. And the example I give is that if a tiger eats a deer, then there's no more deer left. The DNA of the deer is broken down into the smaller and smaller parts until there is no DNA left, and then these parts are reassembled into the tiger's DNA. So if Indian civilization gets digested into the West, what you have is a stronger West. There's no Indian civilization left. And if you don't believe this, you look at what happened to the pagans of Europe. They're gone, and their civilization, a lot of their ideas have become part of Christianity, like the Christmas tree, like the Easter. These are all pagan rituals and customs and symbols. They become part of their Christianity now. Similarly, the Native Americans, so much was taken and digested out of them, but the Native Americans themselves perished. So civilizations have died. It is not that civilizations are there forever. So unless we are clear what is distinct about us, and we are able to explain it, and we are able to be very confident in explaining it, and we resist being digested as part of the West, we will get digested. So the question then comes, what's wrong with it? Suppose you all become Western digested, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is you'll never be first class, you'll always be second class. In the terms of being Western, as the paradigm, as the universalism, you will never control what the reference points are. You will never be the authority. The authorities on Western thought are Westerners. The authority on their paradigm. It's like if China were to take over the world. The way I explain this to Americans who want to understand why I'm concerned is I tell them this, that suppose someday in the future China is the dominant country in the world, and because they're dominant country, they've started spreading Mandarin language everywhere, and they own much of the world media. They buy off all the major American media, and Chinese people running it, and they start schools, and they start teaching American people Mandarin, and the great Chinese thinkers, and Chinese philosophy. And so within 50 years or 100 years, 2-3 generations are raised on the Chinese paradigm, and people are all clamoring to look Chinese and behave Chinese in order to get jobs. And the matrimonial ads are saying, I'm partly Chinese, because maybe you'll be considered a little superior that way. So suppose Americans become colonized like that, then what's wrong is that you will never be at par with the actual Chinese. You will always be below them, because you will never be as Chinese as the Chinese are. And you lost your sense of your bearings, your foundations, turn it over to somebody else, and they'll always control, they'll always dominate. So Americans understand that it is legitimate for an Indian to feel this way. Getting digested is a second class. You're secured as your place is a glass ceiling, and you're secured as a second class person. Now, with this, I've written the book, and what I just told you is like chapter 1, why the book is written. The rest of the book is each chapter pointing out one area of difference, which is very sharp difference. The image on the cover of the book is what's called Samudra Manthan, which is the Devas and Asuras struggling to churn the ocean and produce creativity. And that's how opposites can be in mutual tension, can also be in cooperation. So in the back are the Asuras and in the front are the Devas. So that's sort of the metaphor used for this book. And the idea here is to not say we are superior, but we're not inferior, we're just different. That's what it is. So there are 4 or 5 major chapters, each describing in detail one particular kind of difference. And the purpose is to create a sense of identity using those differences which are not easily digested, given away, unless you distort them. If you preserve the authenticity of these qualities, they will remain distinct and you can create a sense of identity. Now, this Samudra Manthan, or struggle with an opposite person, back and forth, working back and forth, churning. I've done this for informally for 40 years, but very explicitly and systematically for the last 20 years. I've done it with Christian who are Catholic theologians, Protestants, secular Americans, scientific atheists. I've done it with Indians who are atheists and Marxists. I've done it with different schools of Hinduism, Vaishnavites, ISKCON people, Sri Aurobindo people. I've done it with Buddhists. So I've done it with a wide range of people, this kind of manthan, my own manthan or journey to produce this book. Now, the problem is as follows. Those of you who are into solving simultaneous equations and optimization, I'll put it in that way. The problem is that to be different from the West it seems to be in conflict with having a commonality internally. Because if I take positions that are different from the West, then if I use those as the position of our civilization, I will find internal disagreement. The Sri Aurobindo people will say, I don't accept that, that's too Vaishnavite. The Vaishnava, if it's leaning towards Advait, then some other school of Indian thought won't accept it, Buddhists won't accept it. So the internal manthan among the Indian schools of thought is very complicated also. And on the other hand, if I start with the Indian schools of thought, trying to sort it out, that can go on forever because people in the Indian systems have been arguing for hundreds of years and they haven't sorted it out, and I'm not going to sort it out, So this is a very complex problem. How to define an Indian position philosophically and metaphysically in such a delicate way, in such a carefully crafted way, that I can satisfy wide range of Indian thinkers who will say, yeah, we accept it, and at the same time show that it is quite different from the Western position. This is the trick that I have to do. Yeah, it's like if you're running a coalition government, then the coalition has to be sufficiently different from the opposition. Because if you have nothing different to say, why are you there? What do you offer? You have to be different. And yet you need unity within, among your coalition partners. So you cannot be too sharply defined because you need to be inclusive and include all the partners within. And yet you cannot be too broadly defined because you need to be different from the other. So this is a challenge of simultaneously opposing things have to be balanced out. So that's the process and the methodology that I carried out. And one of the primary differences I've discovered is that the Westerners are obsessed with a unique and absolute history that they feel they have had. And no other history has the same status as their own. And this has to do with the Bible, the uniqueness of one Son of God, the origin of original sin, the idea that there is a virgin birth, there is idea that there is a crucifixion, and Jesus is sacrificed. And so this story of these particular historical points cannot be tampered with, cannot be compromised. It has to be taken literally. This is something they're very adamant about. And I coined the term history-centric. I call this behavior, this kind of mentality, history-centric. And in the Dharma traditions, the idea of the past is important only as a role model, as a guide on how you can live. But in the present moment, you same state of consciousness. You can evolve through yoga, through sadhana, through meditation. You have the potential in you to a higher exalted state of consciousness, which means whether it's easy to achieve or difficult to achieve doesn't matter, because in theory it's possible to achieve, so you're not totally dependent on history. So the use of history in the West has been a method of control. It's like Microsoft Windows source code. Like the Microsoft people control that source code, and that is the whole reason they exist. So this particular history is that kind of intellectual property of the church, and without that they won't be able to exist. So controlling this historicity has become very obsessive, and the Dharma traditions, as contrasted with the Abrahamic traditions, I have a whole lot of discussion going on, that these are very different approaches to the truth. One is on studying history, and the other is on studying the self. It's a philosophical debate that I get into a lot. Another difference I find is that I found throughout my stay in the US that Indians are much more comfortable dealing with chaos, or what the Westerners call chaos. Things don't go exactly as expected, things are unpredictable, there may be some uncertainty, there may be some mix-up, things may be partly this and partly that, things may be opposites existing simultaneously, things are both X and not X at the same time. And Indians are more able to deal with complexity. So this is my finding, than Americans, who want to know, is it X or is it not X? It can't be both. When you have a meeting, when I would have a project meeting, there would be some Indians and some white Americans sitting there. Indians are having many conversations at the same time. So A is talking to B, C is talking to D, and E is talking to both A and B, and A is listening to D but talking to him. Now, the Westerners feeling extremely disturbed about it, very concerned. They're saying it's chaos. What is going on? Very difficult to figure out. And after a lot of, half an hour of this, okay, meeting is concluded. Are we all agreeing? Indian are happy, satisfied, he can go do his job. Because he's filtered out multiple parallel conversations, parallel processing, and not having to be linear. And then the Westerners will come to my office and say, but I don't know what happened. I have no idea what they are saying. What are they saying? They're saying this and they're saying that. What are they saying? So I have to sit down and linearize it for them to make it clear. I found this to be a different trait between the Indians and the Westerners. And this became clear to me at the last Kumbh Mela in Haridwar. I was a guest of Swami Avdeshanand, who's the Juna Akhada, head of the Juna Akhada, where all the Naga sadhus go, and tens of thousands, lakhs of them. So I was staying with him, and there was a TV crew from the United States, ABC News. They wanted to do a documentary on Kumbh Mela. And they had spent 1 month in Haridwar interviewing a lot of people. So they were interviewing the Swami. And I had packed my bags, I was about to leave, my car was waiting. And the Swami says to them, you should interview this man also, he'll have something to say. So I said, okay, I'll stay and answer your questions. And they said, we just need a 5-minute clip from a lot of people, so 5 minutes. It turned out to be a 3-hour interview. Because the first question the guy asked is, he says, I'm asking everybody this question. How do we explain to the Americans, we've been here for a month and we've gone and seen all this. How do we explain to the Americans all this chaos? Yeah. So I said, I hadn't thought of saying it this way, but I just quickly got this idea. So I said that this chaos is your cognitive overload. You are not able to understand it. It overwhelms your models. Your models are very simple. You have 10 commandments for the whole cosmos. But 10 commandments, you cannot even run your TV station on 10 rules. It's more complex. Life is more complex than that. So your model of thinking is simple models. and you are expecting very, orderly things happening, very organized, predictable things happening, and everybody conforming, that sort of behavior. And here, things are not like that. You are calling it chaos, but if you go to these guys who are doing different things, they are relaxed about it. They are doing their thing, and they are not worrying that somebody else is doing something different, and they are not trying to make it all uniform and everything should be same. They are not trying to do that. Everybody is happy, contented doing what he's doing, and that somebody else is doing something else does not bother him. So the chaos is not there in them. The chaos is in your own way of thinking. It's the Western obsession for order which makes this look like chaos. That's what I told him. He was very fascinated by that. He said, you are the only guy who told me like that, because everybody else is apologetic and saying, oh no, these people are poor, they're not educated, they're not modern. One day we'll also become very orderly. But you are the only person who's given me you've reversed the gaze, and the problem is in our side, we're thinking that. So actually when they presented this, they took a lot of my discussion and made it main part of the documentary. That this appears to Westerners as chaos, but an Indian thinks that it's about us, that we are calling it chaos. So this sort of attitude towards decentralized, I give a chapter 4 is on order and chaos. The Indian and the Western attitudes towards order and chaos. In the Indian, both are important and they're held in balance. Order is important. What Westerners think chaos, we don't have a word in Sanskrit for chaos, by the way, because we do not have that obsession. So this decentralized, very, very complex, non-linear, unpredictable, uncertainty principle, all these kind of things, along with this very Newtonian, predictable, reductive order, these two opposites are both there in the Indian system. After all, you cannot say Indians cannot handle order, because if you look at the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization is the most orderly civil engineering, the most orderly constructed among the ancient world. So Indians certainly can do that. And you look at computer science, which requires very analytical, algorithmic thinking, or any of these things. So Indians can certainly do that. And yet the raga, when it's played, every time it's an improvisation. It is not there's no written scores like in Western music. You're repeating the same thing each time from written scores. It's improvised from within. It's a feeling. And the way dance is performed is highly improvised. I have a friend who wrote a bestseller, one of the first bestsellers on Indian cooking. It was called Curries Without Worries, something like that, 20, 30 years ago. So I asked her, what made your book a bestseller in the US? Because a lot of people, these recipes are very ordinary. She says, I understood the Western mind, so my cooking book is written with things like, take so many ounces of this, heat it to so many degrees for so many minutes. Yes. And she says, an Indian chef would never think of this way. You go to any restaurant, no chef is weighing so many ounces and looking at thermometer temperature. But if you explain it like this, the Westerner understands it, and then he buys it, and my book is a bestseller. So it became a very big seller. So this person understood. Now, all this is going to help you in your product design. You see, Japanese are very clever. They understood the American mind and created products. Do you know who first put radios in cars? Japanese, Toyota. First cars where there was a radio in the car was not Ford, was not General Motors, was not Chevrolet, was not Chrysler. Americans invented the car, and Americans invented the radio. Japanese understood that they're sitting in traffic jams for so long, they want to watch radio at home, but they're sitting in traffic jams, they're upset. So it's a Japanese mind which understood the psychology. That, hey, I put the radio in the car, and that was a big hit. That is how they started off with their big USP, as you call it. So this topic I'm saying is not irrelevant for technocrats and so on. I will stop because I want to hear what others have to say. But one final thing, those who are really serious about it, I have some 2-page notes on the book, which I'm happy to hand out to anybody who's going to be a serious reader. I would also love to have the email addresses of those who want to continue the online. We have an e-group and we're having an online discussion on this book. And those who are interested should give me a card or on a piece of paper your email address. I'll make you a member of that, and then the discussion can continue. Thank you very much.